Hi, I'm Eitan Diamond. Glad to be joining you for this live streaming event. I'm going to be talking about big data and implementation of the law of armed conflict. And as this title suggests, I'm going to be presenting some thoughts about ways in which technologies capable of capturing and analyzing large volumes of data and metadata might affect the implementation of the law of armed conflict. To coordinate expectations, I'll note from the outset that I'll only be offering some preliminary observations, suggesting avenues for further exploration rather than any finished work. Also, I'm going to be touching on some of many relevant issues. I want, for example, be talking about big data's implication on the regulation of cyber warfare, and there's a lot to be said about that. I also want to more than hint at its relevance for the regulation of autonomous weapon systems, again, an area that's open to a great deal of research and speculation. What I do want to do is to present some observations about common features of contemporary armed conflict as a starting point. Armed conflicts as they unfold in physical space, about the possible impact that big data might have on such conflict environments, and to then consider what this might mean for the application of the law of armed conflict. So I'll begin then with those features of armed conflict that I referred to. And the first of these is one that dates back to time immemorial. It's captured by the expression the fog of war. And it has to do with the fact that armed conflicts are complex collaborative enterprises. They involve many moving pieces, moving over an extended area. For a warring party, there's going to be an effort to try and coordinate between those various moving pieces, moving on its behalf, its personnel, all the means of warfare that it's operating, and this can be challenging. It becomes more challenging when they have to, at the same time, try to uncover what the opposing party is trying to do and hide what it's doing from the opposing party. So there's a lot going on, and the picture isn't very clear for those involved in armed conflicts generally. They're making life and death decisions, really dramatic decisions, under high pressure, in this foggy situation where information isn't very clear, and that poses many challenges. The second feature, and this is a characteristic of contemporary armed conflicts, increasingly a characteristic of those conflicts, has to do with the fact that armed conflicts, and this in a way contradicts the previous observation, they generate a huge volume of data. Increasingly, conflicts nowadays take place in densely populated areas, in cities and urban environments, rather than in an open battlefield. It's very rare nowadays to have two opposing parties clashing on an open battlefield. Instead, they operate in and among civilians and civilian infrastructure. You can think, for example, of the conflict now taking place in Syria. That conflict is generating a tremendous amount of information. The information comes from the belligerent parties. They don't necessarily share that with the public at large, but they have devices that are documenting in various ways what's occurring in the conflict zone. So they have satellites and drones and all sorts of other mechanisms to document what's going on. But there are also civilians on the ground recording their experiences, either intentionally or just by using their smartphones, etc. They're producing a lot of data that's relevant to understanding the conflict environment. And some of that data is being mined by the belligerent parties. Now, I said this contrasts the fog of war because you suddenly have this mass of information, but that's not necessarily the case because having a lot of information doesn't necessarily offer a clearer picture. Sometimes a lot of information can just cause great confusion. And I refer here to the expression vignettes because in a way that's what you often have. You have, say, a piece of footage filmed by a civilian with their smartphone in the street. Then you have satellite imagery or drone imagery documenting another aspect of the conflict, etc., etc. You have all these little bits of information, these little stories uncovering one element from a particular perspective of the conflict, but that doesn't necessarily come together to tell a coherent story. It's very difficult to actually make sense of so much data, certainly for human beings. But the technologies that we now have at our disposal are capable of capturing and sifting through and making sense of all this big data. And this carries potential to perhaps lift the fog of war, to make sense of information and to understand what's happening more clearly. And this has many repercussions for the warring parties' capacity to wage successful military campaigns. It actually operates in various time zones. So on the one hand, it enables the parties to gather key intelligence about the enemy and also to better coordinate between their own forces. It enhances the ability to document and analyze what occurred on the battlefield beforehand, so looking to the past. But it also provides a clearer vision of the battle space in the present, so you know what happened beforehand, and that can be crucial for planning ahead, but also where everyone is at this moment. And perhaps more dramatically, algorithms detecting patterns hidden in big data can infer from information about the past and present what is most likely to happen next, to look into the future. If armed conflicts, as I said before, involve a lot of moving pieces, then big data can inform where those pieces were, where they are now, how they interrelate, and even where they are likely to be next. This can enable belligerents to wage war more effectively, and since war involves killing people and breaking things, from a humanitarian perspective, this can be quite worrisome. The fact that the belligerents will be more effective at waging war is not necessarily a good thing for people on the ground. That being said, there's also a possibility that greater efficiency will result in less harm to civilians. And it's actually at this point that the law of armed conflict has something to say. Now, I realize not everyone listening in on this is an expert on the law of armed conflict, and obviously I won't have time to go into all the details of this body of law. It's quite comprehensive, but I do want to point out to some aspects that are relevant to the present discussion. So I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of the law of armed conflict in a nutshell. So the law of armed conflict is a body of law that states have agreed upon in order to regulate the conduct of the parties to armed conflict. Its underlying purpose is not a kind of utopian or pacifist goal of prohibiting war and related violence. Instead, it's a pragmatic body of law that accepts the unfortunate reality of war and also the need of the warring parties to pursue certain military objectives and military needs, but at the same time seeks for humanitarian purposes to prevent unnecessary suffering and to preserve some core human values. To that end, it imposes certain limits on permissible force. So the idea is to create a kind of balance between military necessity, military needs, which are accepted as something that militaries can legitimately pursue, and on the other hand, humanitarian considerations. So whenever use of force exceeds what's necessary for military purposes and causes humanitarian harm, then the law will intervene and try to introduce some constraints on the use of force. For present purposes, I want to highlight some elements of the architecture of the law of armed conflict, elements that are particularly relevant to consider when one is trying to assess the possible implications of big data. What I have in mind are, first, the fact that the law of armed conflict depends on classifications, and secondly, that it entails forward-looking evaluations, and all this has to be done within the fog of war that I referred to before. So if we begin with classifications, classifications are particularly important for determining who and what can be targeted and when they can be targeted, who can be the subject of an attack. The basic principle is easily stated. Civilians and civilian infrastructure are supposed to be off limits. Fighters and military objects can be attacked. And then there's some sub-categories that you have before you on the slide. Sometimes civilians taking part in hostilities can also be attacked. And there are certain circumstances in which fighters cannot be attacked. For example, when they're injured or when they've fallen captive, when they're basically outside the cycle of violence. Now, while it's simple to state these principles, in practice, the distinctions are often difficult to make, particularly under the trying circumstances of armed conflict, where life and death decisions have to be made very quickly. And the challenges are, of course, escalated in the nowadays common situations where the conflict involves non-state armed groups and all sorts of irregular forces who often don't look like fighters. They look very much like civilians. And also with the hostilities taking place not on a battlefield, but in and among civilian infrastructure and among civilians. So you have the military objects and civilian objects intertwined, the military personnel and civilians in close proximity, and now you have a challenge in trying to distinguish between the two. And when it comes to some of these categories, say an enemy soldier or a tank, there's a presumption that military needs will be served by attacking them. What that means is that once you've identified them, that they fall within the category, this is a soldier, this is a tank, you don't have to make any further evaluations and they can immediately be attacked. But in other cases, it's necessary to evaluate further whether the current or likely future use of an object and justify attacking it, and whether there's a military advantage to be gained by doing so. And now this becomes evident when you look at the definition of a military object, which is a rather complex definition. You have it before you on the slide. Just to pick out one element, so the term purpose relates to the expected future use. So you have to estimate, the belligerent has to estimate on the basis of the circumstances ruling in the present, whether destroying, say, a house that's expected to serve a military purpose in the future would offer a definite military advantage. Now, this is obviously not a simple exercise, particularly when decisions need to be made in the heat of battle. Outside the context of armed conflict, the law usually restricts state violence to circumstances of immediate necessity. And here I'm coming to the second observation I made before about future-orientated evaluation. So law in general, when it comes to the regulation of violence, allows state actors, state agents, to use lethal or potentially lethal force only as a last resort to prevent an imminent and weighty risk from materializing. So they're not allowed to speculate too far into the future. It's just when there's something really immediate happening now or about to happen in the immediate future that they can use force. Similarly, when it comes to depriving a person of their liberty, imprisoning them, this can only be done as a punishment for a criminal act that was committed in the past, not because of what we think someone might do in the future. So big data is used in criminal justice systems nowadays to take precautionary measures in advance to kind of identify areas where there's potential risk. But you don't actually throw someone in prison normally because you think they might do something in the future, something they haven't actually done yet. In the law of armed conflict, the situation is different. It allows force, including lethal force, to be used to prevent a future threat from materializing. So enemy fighters and military objects can be destroyed even when they're not posing an imminent threat. And the justification for that is that it's presumed or has been established that this could produce a military advantage. You strike at this tank, you'll gain a military advantage. You destroy this house that's going to be used by the enemy, you'll gain a military advantage, and you can do so even before they've actually used it to harm you or they're about to do so. Likewise, enemy fighters can be detained to prevent them from posing a future threat. So when it comes to soldiers, they can be placed as prisoners of war, they can be detained, and that isn't because of what they've done, but to remove them from the cycle of violence. A similar set of arrangements applies to other fighters who aren't soldiers operating for a state, but rather belligerents operating on behalf of an armed group. And also with respect to civilians. So the law of armed conflicts allows civilians affiliated with the opposing party to be detained in certain circumstances when it's deemed necessary for military purposes, for security purposes. So not because of what they've done, but because of what they might do in the future to neutralize the threat. In addition to all this, the law of armed conflict often calls for judgment based on assessment of likely future outcome. We saw some indication of this when considering the definition of military object before, but it's even more pronounced when it comes to the application of the principle of proportionality in attack. You have the definition before you on the slide. Again, this is a rather complex kind of legal category. And what it calls on the person about the party about to launch an attack to do is to conduct a really complicated exercise where they have to evaluate against each other, on the one hand, the military advantage anticipated from striking at a military objective, and on the other hand, the expected incidental harm to civilians. So balancing these two against each other, military advantage anticipated against expected harm to civilians, is a very difficult exercise. I'm not sure big data will help with that. But what it will help, or could potentially help with, is actually just evaluating the two elements of this equation. Military advantage anticipated, that requires looking ahead into the future to evaluate on the basis of whatever data is available what advantages are expected from attacking a particular target, and then also assessing the incidental harm to civilians, what that's likely to be. And I suggested a moment ago that big data might be able to help here. What I think one has to say about big data is that it can operate as a double-edged sword when it comes to the implementation of the law of armed conflict. So I'm going to be talking about the perspective of a party to a conflict that actually respects the law of armed conflict. Obviously, that's not the case with all belligerents, and if they just want to use data to exert force without any restraint, then this isn't going to be very relevant for them. But states in particular often do want to at least seem to be seen to adhere to the law of armed conflict. And big data could facilitate more effective application of this body of law, and also better protection for civilians and civilian objects, better humanitarian protection. So I suppose the main way I see this materializing is in facilitating more accurate classifications and evaluations. We spoke before about the central role of classifications and evaluations in the law of armed conflict. So if you have more data on the basis of which to evaluate whether a person is a civilian or an enemy fighter, then you're likely to make more accurate decisions. The same is true of civilian objects. More accurate decisions would mean, in the hands of a party, again, that respects the law of armed conflict, less civilian casualties and less destruction of civilian objects. Attacks will be targeted only where they ought to be targeted. The same is true of detention of civilians. So if it's possible with rich data to ascertain more reliably who is likely to pose a military risk, then only those people will be detained, and cases in which civilians who don't pose a threat are detained will diminish. Assessments of anticipated military advantage, expected harm to civilians, all these forward-looking evaluations, they could probably be done more effectively if the evaluation was done on the basis of a richer analysis of data. So if more relevant data was captured, analyzed, it's quite likely that the evaluations would be more accurate. I mean, this is, in a way, common sense. More information accurately analyzed gives more accurate decisions. Also, with data captured, if it's recorded well, there will also be more options for ex post facto review of what the belligerents have done. At least internally, the armed forces will be able to theoretically review the actions of their forces and establish whether the decisions they made were lawful. Of course, the capacity to do that would depend on access. Only those parties with access to the information would be able to conduct such a review. Now, I said it's a double-edged sword, and I'm just going to point out to some possible risks that may arise. The first that I find disconcerting has to do with the risk of overextending the kind of preventative logic that exists in the law of armed conflict. So the idea that you can use force because of something that you foresee happening in the future is already a little bit troubling, as is the idea that you can detain someone because of something you think they might do in the future. But when human agents implement the law of armed conflict, they're not able to look far beyond the imminent or immediate risks. The kind of evaluations that people are capable of doing are relatively limited. But if you start having machines crunching big data, evaluating what's likely to happen in the future, there's a risk that there'll be a kind of minority report, for those of you familiar with the film, approach to the law of armed conflict. That is, you'll have all these assessments and decisions being made looking far into the future or analyzing a very broad array of data to reach conclusions about likely risks, and then on that basis using perhaps lethal force. And I'm concerned, at least, that when this starts happening, the force that will be unleashed will exceed that the original drafters of the law of armed conflict had in mind, and what the humanitarian underlying purpose of the law of armed conflict justifies. So it's one thing to recognize that in the fog of war, you have to, and when they're facing risks from an opposing armed force, you have to allow belligerents some leeway to use force to prevent harm being caused to them. But to transfer decisions or these kinds of preventative logic into the hands of machines that can look so much further into the future or analyze so much more data, I think that opens up possibly a Pandora's box, which we might very well want to keep closed. At least we have to give it quite a bit of thought. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, we're seeing a little bit of what this kind of algorithmic implementation of the law might lead to. So here we're seeing it in relation to detention. So Palestinians are placed in some cases under administrative detention, that is, under detention for preventative purposes. And increasingly you hear reports about cases where people are detained on the basis of an analysis of their activities online and other bits and pieces of information which are said to suggest that they pose a risk. In other contexts, and there's not very much transparency on this issue, but there's also reporting about decisions about targeting to conduct what are referred to as signature strikes that the U.S. Forces implement, and this is to some degree at the level of rumors, but there is talk about analysis of data, large bodies of data informing these signature strikes. So if a particular individual has been recorded as being next to other individuals who are suspect, conducting certain activities, purchasing certain goods, behaving in a certain way online, etc., etc., a lot of data is collected, and this reveals a kind of pattern that can, at least for the machine able to digest all this information, suggest likelihood that a particular individual poses a threat. Whether or not it's justified on that kind of basis to strike at someone, kill someone, deprive them of their liberty, is, I think, an issue that's at least questionable and requires further reflection. Now, another issue has to do with who's actually making the decisions. So big data is too big for the human brain to be able to process. Decisions in armed conflict, I've said this a few times during the talk, have to be made quite quickly. You have to respond to a threat rapidly. And for humans to assess big data in a reasonable time frame is often going to be impossible. Now, if we have machines that are capable of assessing this data, the question is, are we going to allow the machines to make the judgment calls that are relevant? And if not, how are humans going to be brought into the loop when, again, they're limited in their capacity to take in all the data in a relevant time frame? Now, this introduces ethical and philosophical questions. The idea that judgment on life and death issues, on human liberty, will be transferred to machines is one that many of us found troubling. I'm not going to attempt to delve into those ethical and philosophical questions here, but I think any reasonable person can understand that there's a lot of thought that has to be put in to these issues. But there are also practical concerns that arise. So, for example, the machine might make an error. It's looking through all this data, it's looking at data and identifying patterns based on past practices to make decisions that are future orientated, and it's likely that it might make mistakes. That's troubling when the result of that mistake might be that someone is killed. Also, even if the machines operate well, there is a risk that people will intervene and subvert the way the machines operate. So hacking, etc., are concerned. So there are these practical concerns that also arise and that we have to think quite carefully about before we allow machines to make judgment in situations of the law of armed conflict, before we turn the judgment that at present is left to warring parties and to human judges to pass that over to algorithms. Now, how we solve all those problems, how we deal with all them is, obviously a matter that will require a great deal of research, and this kind of work has already been begun in some places. I just want to point out to some areas where I think further thoughts and steps have to be taken or might need to be taken. So the rules of the law of armed conflict are very difficult to change, actually, because they're made by states, and you need states to agree on changing them, and it's not clear that it's going to be possible to change them to adapt to a reality where big data is affecting the implementation of the law of armed conflict, particularly as some states will have different interests than others. But somehow I think it is important, and for civil society as well, to push for a re-evaluation at least of the rules. And it might not require changing the rules, but perhaps adapting their interpretation so that some of the concerns that arise when big data is informing decisions regarding the application of the law of armed conflict are being made. So, for example, establishing clearer boundaries on the scope of inferences and forward-looking evaluations permitting the use of force. So, at the moment, the scope of these inferences has been limited in a way by the limits of human beings. But now that we've got potentially more advanced ways of looking forward, we have to reflect again on how much we're going to allow this kind of forward-looking evaluation to permit the use of lethal force and also the deprivation of liberty. Thought has to be put into mechanisms for human control over the decision-making of the machines that are crunching the big data, the algorithms that are being used. Not clear how that's going to be done. As I said, there's a substantial challenge here in that people are not able to assess vast data very quickly. So some kind of mechanism where you are able to take advantage of the capacities of the machines, and yet there's a man in the loop or a woman in the loop making these decisions, I think is crucial and challenging. Now, lastly, when these decisions are being made by machines or by people working with machines, it's going to be very important to evaluate whether the decisions that have been reached are lawful, to take advantage actually of the fact that more data is available and recorded to assess, evaluate whether the law has been respected. And there, I think it's important to consider who is going to have access to the information. Now, obviously, in conflict, warring parties have legitimate interests in obscuring some information and keeping it secret. But on the other hand, in the interest of careful review of the conduct of hostilities, I think it's crucial that some bodies are identified that will be able to scrutinize all this data that's available and assess whether the law is being respected, whether humanitarian interests are being protected as they should be. Again, these are just initial thoughts. There's a great deal more work that has to be done here. I just wanted in this talk to kind of point to some of the concerns and causes for concern, and also the reasons for hope related to big data. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks a lot.